Welcome to the first week of our independent study for Britlit 1. Excuse me. Of course, as soon as I started recording this, the apartment next door has work being done. So I don't know if you can hear. I don't know if it's disruptive to you. Hopefully it's not. Excuse me. So today I'm going to go over some background to Beowulf with you. And we're going to look at the poet's views of heroic society and the ways that his views of heroics or his values as a Christian conflict with the values of heroic society. So for the first half of Beowulf, questions to keep in mind as you read are, one, where do you see the influence of the poet's Christian beliefs? So sometimes it will be more subtle, and other times it will be very, like he's hitting you over the head with his beliefs. Excuse me. A second question to think about is, do you see this poem as a celebration of heroic society or a critique? Now, just for your information, you might want to know that the majority view on Beowulf by critics is that it is a critique of heroic society, not a celebration. And I would argue that position myself. I think that if you look very superficially at Beowulf, you see what appears to be a celebration of the hero and a celebration of heroic society. But if you look at it, if you give it more of a careful read, I think it's really hard to see it as a celebration of heroic society. And then a third question, to what extent is this poem about the futility of man's efforts and the vanity of human endeavor? Okay, so just a little bit of information here. Beowulf is believed, there are disputes, but again, majority view held by critics and scholars is that it was composed in the 8th century by a single Christian poet, and that this poet drew from previously existing oral tales. So the poet who composed this version of Beowulf that we study, he did not compose this as an original text. He didn't make it up. It wasn't his creation. This existed already in circulating oral tales. The subject is the pagan heroic society that had existed several hundred years in the past. So the poet is writing about a past time and a past society. It is believed that much of what he writes is based on truth, but it's also important for us to realize that the poet is writing about a time that he did not live through and that he did not experience firsthand. So the values of heroic society, I'm going to identify them for you. They often conflict with the poet's values. So, for example, the first scene that we're going to look at in the very beginning is a pagan funeral ritual, and the ceremony is very over the top in terms of the material items that are specifically like gold and treasures are heaped onto the body of the dead king, and then then the king is pushed out to sea. Now the poet, well, I don't want to ruin it because we're going to go and look at it, but there are many scenes in Beowulf where, for example, warriors are rewarded with treasure, and then we also see warriors like Beowulf who are very much living in pursuit of fame and glory. So, and then we also see another value, which is seeking vengeance. So none of those are all very much at odds with the Christian values of forgiveness, for example, humility, and then I don't know if it would be an anti-materialist sentiment, but the poet does not share the materialistic values of heroic society, that's for sure. So in heroic society, the most important relationship was that which existed between a warrior or a thane and his lord or king. And the warrior's job was to fight to the death to achieve blood vengeance. And in doing so, he would be rewarded by the Lord. So warriors were typically provided with food and shelter, and then, treasures and luxuries when they went above and beyond. So to fight to the death was considered like a sacred responsibility. Anything less would probably lead a warrior to die of shame. So anything less than fighting to the death for either one's king or one of one's kinsmen would be considered shameful. The king's duty, we might see this is relevant because we see Beowulf as a warrior in part 1, but in part 2 he is a king. Now, contrary to what you might think, a king's primary responsibility is not to fight for his people, but to protect his people. And for a king, protecting his people means having warriors who will fight for him. So the king can strategically designate the fighting to others, and he doesn't have to put himself and his life at risk. The relationships between kinsmen or two warriors were also extremely important. Let's say two warriors, two kinsmen fighting, and one of them is killed, it becomes the responsibility, again, a sacred responsibility of the surviving warrior to exact what is called a man price from the enemy. And that would just mean the price that the killed warrior is said to have been worth based on a lot of factors. And the man price would be exacted from the person who kills the warrior. And if it wasn't received, then that's where the blood vengeance comes in. So women in Beowulf are very easy to miss. I think the first couple of times I read this, I kind of wondered, where are the women? And we don't ever know if Beowulf got married. I would say it's safe to conclude that he doesn't, because, not to ruin things, but when he is dying, he notes that he has no son to leave the kingdom to. But there is also no mention of it. At no point when Beowulf, again, towards the end of his life, is reflecting upon the death that is coming and the life that he lived, at no point does he think about a wife or children or any type of love. And the reason for this is because the audiences at this time, or at the time when this was composed and when it was circulating as an oral tale, they would not have cared about Beowulf's love life. They would not. They just wouldn't have cared. So you will, if you look very carefully, you will see women appear very briefly in Beowulf, most often as queens or as the wives of kings. Like we'll see King Hrothgar's wife, and she's serving wine at one of the celebrations. But the more important role that women serve, which is also, even though it was super important, we only see just a tiny little bit of evidence of it. And this is women as peace weavers. So a job that was designated to women when there were two tribes who were feuding. The daughter of one of the leaders of the tribes would be married to the son of one of the leaders of the feuding tribe of the other tribe, and it was hoped that this marriage would sort of heal the feud. However, so that the two warring tribes would be able to live in peace. going forward. However, this pretty much never works. And in Beowulf, it's very interesting. There are two times when the poet goes out of his way to bring up peace weavers and situations where there's a relationship between warring tribes, and a peace weaver is brought in an attempt to sort of heal the situation. But in both cases, it doesn't work. And in one case, the results are really disastrous, but we're going to look at that, so I won't spoil it for you. Two quotes I want to read you from critics. One is from H.L. Rogers, and you can hear in this that he's not seeing this as a celebration of heroic society. He writes, "The poet saw the heroic past of the Danes and the Geats through the eyes of a Christian Anglo-Saxon. In his poem, heroic, material, and worldly things all fail." And then I have another quote, and this is from Seamus Heaney, who did the translation of Beowulf that we are reading. And Heaney is an Irish poet, and he was also a huge fan of Beowulf, which is why he did this translation, because he was of the opinion that there was not a good enough translation that existed, so he decided to create his own translation. So he says, "The entire poem could be viewed as the poet's lament for heroes like Beowulf, who went into the darkness without the light of the poet's own Christian faith." One little fact that I want to share with you that I think is very interesting is that despite the way we view Beowulf now, I think that, well, it's essential reading in any British literature class. It's probably considered the first great English language poem or epic poem. However, Beowulf was not read as literature until 1906, and that was when J.R.R. Tolkien of Hobbit fame presented a paper at a conference in England in which he argued that it was actually great literature and great poetry. Now, up until this point, Beowulf was read by historians who combed through the details for historical detail and information. And then it was also read by linguists who were also, combing through the text to learn about Old English. So after Tolkien read his paper, which was called Beowulf, the Critics and the Monsters. I think it's the Critics and the Monsters, but it's the something and the Monsters if it's not the Critics. And after he read the paper, which was a huge success, Beowulf was pretty much instantly adopted or read as literature, and that continues to this very day. So we're going to start by looking at the very first, actually, now I'm going to give you all line numbers because I do have a printout of some of the PDF, but most of the time I will be using my book. So I'll refer to the line numbers. That way you can follow along in the PDF. So let's see, we're going to be looking at line 26 through 52. And in the PDF, this is page 5. Okay, so this is describing a pagan burial or funeral ceremony for King Shield. So I'm just going to read it to you, and this is lines 26 through 52. And the reason we're discussing this together is because this is the passage that I typically discuss with students in Britlit 1, and we usually read it. And the question I ask them to look out for is, what is the poet's view of heroic society, as far as you can tell, just based in this one excerpt. And I ask them to choose a line that supports their position. So if you want, you can do the same thing. Shield was still thriving when his time came and he crossed over into the Lord's keeping. His warrior band did what he bade them when he laid down the law. Oh gosh. My voice is, you can hear, it's very strained. So I'm actually going to cut down to the end, or to line 40. So I'm going to read line 40 to line 52. The masked treasure was loaded on top of him. It would travel far out into the ocean's sway. They decked his body no less bountifully with offerings than those first ones did who cast him away when he was a child and launched him alone out over the waves. And they set a gold standard up high above his head and let him drift to wind and tide, bewailing him and mourning their loss. No man can tell, no wise man in hall or weathered veteran knows for certain who salvaged that load. Now, I probably should have pointed out before I started that we are told starting with line 36, far-fetched treasures were piled upon him and precious gear. I never heard before of a ship so well furbished with battle tackle, bladed weapons, and coats of mail. The masked treasure was loaded on top of him. Okay, so there we go. Now, I would just point out, maybe you want to identify how you think the poet feels about heroic society before you listen to this. But, and I would acknowledge that there are points where he does sort of acknowledge Shield's merits, and he does draw our attention to positive aspects of this culture. However, he is very critical of this ceremony. And how do we know this? Well, he says in line 38, I never heard before of a ship so well furbished with battle tackle, bladed weapons, and coats of mail. And then he tells us the masked treasure was loaded on top of him being Shield. It would travel far out into the ocean's sway. And then towards the end, starting in line 50, we are told, no man can tell, no wise man in hall or weathered veteran knows for certain who salvaged that load. So Shield's tribe is putting treasure onto his body, and they're heaving this beer out into the ocean, and that's it. It's just gonna float until it sinks or until someone finds it and takes all of the treasure. So their belief seems to be that this treasure is going to follow Shield into the afterlife. Or why would they be sending all this with him? However, the poet is pointing out that no one can say what actually happens to this treasure. And the fact that he says, who salvaged that load, the word salvage just lets us know that that he is suggesting that there's some person who's going to find this treasure and salvage it. So it's possible that the poet, there's nothing in here from the poet that lets us know that he thinks it's wasteful. But his only comments are that no one knows who's going to find this and what they're going to do with it. So therefore, it falls upon us to sort of read in between the lines and say, well, maybe the poet thought that this was wasteful. Maybe he wants us to question the materialistic values of these people. Okay, so moving on. page 7. Sorry about that. Computer just shut. Okay, so moving on to page 7 in the PDF, and this is line 64. The stanza begins with the line, "The fortunes of war favored Hrothgar." Now, that is definitely this and the stanza that we just discussed. These are instances of the poet's very subtle criticism of heroic society. There will be other points where he literally inserts his views into the characters, because we have characters like Beowulf and King Hrothgar who do not show Christian behavior. And if we were to judge by their actions, the actions would say that they are not Christian. However, there will be times when, hang on, I just plugged this in. There will be times when Beowulf and Hrothgar say things like, "Oh, praise the Almighty God." And so it is strange that, Beowulf will be, for example, that he will kill Grendel in a really savage way. That's not very Christian at all. But then he'll afterward, "Thank God for giving me that strength." So it is believed that those are the views of the poet, that the poet is inserting his belief that God should be praised and that everything is thanks to God. Because remember, this is a pagan society. Now, it is likely that there were Christian elements mixed, like going back several hundred years to this pagan heroic society. It is very likely that elements of Christianity sort of got mixed in with the pagan beliefs, just because it's confusing, but just because of the way that the land was settled, and then it was conquered by invaders so first there were Christians, and then the invaders came, and then Christianity sort of went up and disappeared into the more mountainous and more, the farther outlying districts. So the invaders sort of pushed the Germanic invaders pushed Christianity out, but it is very possible that elements of it lingered. But again, remember that the pagan, that was the dominant tradition. So it's also odd that we would have pagan characters thanking God and praising God, because that, is not part of their belief system. So moving back to page 7 and line 64, poet tells us, "The fortunes of war favored Hrothgar. Friends and kinsmen flocked to his ranks, young followers, a force that grew to be a mighty army. So his mind turned to hall building. He handed down orders for men to work on a great mead hall, meant to be a wonder of the world forever. It would be his throne room, and there he would dispense his God-given goods to young and old." Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Now, there is a lot of criticism from the poet in these lines. Again, it's subtle, but it's important, and it's important that we recognize it. So, for example, the fortunes of war, that is meant to be ironic, because war, even if you are on the winning side, to say the fortunes of war, that's not really an accurate term, because war always comes with death, suffering, loss. So even if, Hrothgar was on the winning side, to say that the fortunes of war favored him, that's kind of a dig by the poet. Possibly it is his commentary also on this heroic society and their way of life, because war was their way of life. War was pretty much a constant cycle. And there are definitely times where the poet is commenting on that. So anyway, moving on with Hrothgar, he was favored by the fortunes of war, and friends and kinsmen flocked to him so that his force grew to be a mighty army. So he decides to build a hall, and he intends it to be a wonder of the world forever. Now, there are 7 wonders of the world, and I think Machu Picchu is one, Stonehenge is another. Oh gosh, excuse me, I'm sorry. So, my point though is that none of the wonders of the world, well, they seem to be possibly man-made, but it also, there's a mystery to them. So for Hrothgar to have this mead hall built and intend that it's going to be a wonder of the world, that's very arrogant of him. And the poet is definitely pointing that out to us. Something else that is significant in line 71, it would be his throne room. And there he would dispense his God-given goods to young and old. So the poet is pointing out that without God, Hrothgar would have none of this. That this is all only possible because of God. So this is where I'm going to stop. I hope this helps you with the first half of Beowulf. I'm also going to provide you with reading questions. So between this lecture and the questions, I think you'll be in a good place. And the response paper, if you would like a prompt for it, would be, what is the poet's, or what do you, in your opinion, what is the poet's view of heroic society? Is the poet celebrating? Is he criticizing? Is he commemorating? So how does he view heroic society, and what is he aiming to do with this poem, Beowulf? Okay.